Thank you very much. Okay, so for the last presenter, can I invite Dr. Sophal here?
Yes, thank you very much. And I wasn't particularly creative with the title of my talk here or the memo itself, Cambodia's Conceptualization of the International Order since 9/11. So essentially what I could find was that the idea that the authorities have in terms of where the international order stands is that the international order becomes a, quote, sphere of opportunity rather than a sphere of scrutiny for Cambodia. And so what does that mean? It means essentially that from scrutinizing Cambodia for its defects of democracy, human rights, unfreedom, it becomes a place where Cambodia can go to obtain resources, prestige, perennially wants to join the Security Council, very much taking charge of the chairmanship of ASEAN, for example. And that's understandable. After years of being a pariah state, Cambodia has a desire to take on these responsibilities. So that article written by Catherine Travaillon argues that the Prime Minister of Cambodia draws on these themes of sphere of opportunity versus sphere of scrutiny to assuage public concerns about Cambodia's supposed break with the West, instead situating the country as emerging into an international, quote, sphere of opportunity in which Cambodia can determine its relations and engagements autonomously on the basis of its economic and other interests. This sphere of opportunity contrasts with the international domain as a sphere of scrutiny in which Cambodia's actions and developments are constantly subjected to inspection and criticism by its international partners who are pursuing their own ideological project and are able and willing to enforce compliance with their norms and values by using their gatekeeping powers to determine access to crucial international institutions and markets. He actually, Prime Minister Hun Sen, talks about this in the sense of the international community. So in a speech in 2018, May 2018, he says, what is the international community? What defines the international community? And he proffers this answer, that the opposition has been obsessed with threats of international pressure or unrecognition by the international community. Have they seen how many countries have continued to support and to work with the royal government of Cambodia? China, India, South Korea, Japan, and countries in ASEAN and others. Are they not the international community? There are 1.35 billion people in China, 1.3 billion people in India. In these two countries alone, there are already more than 2.6 billion people. Are they not the international community, he argues. That discussion, which he had, I think, in front of a fairly normal audience of countrymen, reminded me of an argument made in the book, A Bed for the Night, Humanitarianism in Crisis by David Rafe, in which he asks actually that same question of what is the international community? And he says there, think of the loose talk in diplomatic circles about the international community. At the UN General Assembly, it has become part of the rhetorical boilerplate for almost every resolution to include phrases like, quote, the international community condemns this, or quote, the international community welcomes that. And he goes on to say, essentially, what common international community exists when you have countries that have very little to do with each other, that have very few common values that they share. Countries like, say, Norway with North Korea, or South Korea with Russia, for example. And importantly, this highlights the fact that Hun Sen does not suggest that Cambodia has to reposition itself in response to the shift in the global balance of power from one center of gravity to another. Rather, despite Western criticism of Cambodia's democratic and human rights record, the author argues Cambodia's continued membership in key international institutions and sustained participation in various political and economic arrangements with politically diverse European, American, and Asian countries is presented as evidence of a more fundamental trend towards an international order dominated by pragmatic forms of engagement. So in that sense, while rejecting cooperation or agreement that are conditional on norm compliance, which is that sphere of scrutiny that he says Cambodia does not have to face anymore, it is presented as a measure of the country's ascent in the global hierarchy. So pursuing membership in various organizations, wanting to be part of the Security Council, all of this feeds into that narrative. So I tried in my memo to answer 3 questions. How do Asian states view the current Western crafted liberal international order? Substituted Asian states there later with Cambodia. Do they have their own preferred notion of international order? Would they modify their current order, or would they change it more radically? In either case, what kinds of changes do they envisage? And 3, why and how do Asian states, in this case Cambodia, differentiate between the international norms and institutions governing nation states in general versus those applicable to their immediate, to the immediate region? In other words, do they have different visions of regional and global orders, and why? So that first question, how does Cambodia view the current Western crafted liberal international order? It's interesting. I went and found this white paper, this is a 10-page white paper that argues in its opening that for years, Cambodia was the subject of a campaign of disinformation led by some foreign governments and organizations which twisted historical facts and events in an attempt to portray a negative image of Cambodia and to lay the blame on the government. The royal government of Cambodia issues this paper entitled "To Tell the Truth," with the aim of clarifying and setting the record straight on various controversial issues. And the first quote in this "To Tell the Truth" paper is one from Ron Paul that they use, in which Ron Paul, a former US Congressman, Republican, says, quote, "It is not democracy to send in billions of dollars to push regime change overseas. It is not democracy to send in the NGOs to rewrite laws." And so they take that quote and they say that this quotation is a confirmation that the United States was funding overseas activities with the aim to change a regime the US administration doesn't like. Civil society was used as a tool to start the process of destabilizing the country. It was the case in Ukraine under the Republican administration and in Honduras under the Democrat administration. For years, Cambodia has been facing an increasing campaign led by some foreign governments and organizations that want a regime change in Cambodia. This campaign, fueled by distortion of facts, lies, amplification of minor problems, aims to discredit and blame the existing and legitimate institutions. I would argue that this sort of overall thesis here is actually a well-recognized argument, and we already heard it earlier in the panel. It is an argument that even Xi Jinping around February 2009 has hinted at in an offhand remark to, I think, at the Chinese embassy in Mexico. He said there are a few foreigners with full bellies who have nothing better to do than to try to point their fingers at our country. China does not export revolution, hunger, poverty, nor does China cause you any headaches. Just what else do you want? And it's that export revolution that I think Cambodia has taken on as regime change, color revolution, and all the things that the Western liberal order has tried to do on Cambodia. Now, of course, I've been using Cambodia very loosely here. When you think of Cambodia, think more of Phnom Penh or the regime itself, just as when you think of China, think of Beijing, not necessarily the Chinese people and everybody in China. The second question here reframed in the Cambodian context, does Cambodia or Phnom Penh have its own preferred notion of international order? Would Cambodia modify the current order, or would Cambodia change it more radically? In either case, what kinds of changes does Cambodia envisage? Yeah, of course, it's already framed it in terms of turning its relationship from a sphere of scrutiny, which is looking closely at Cambodia for all the defects and things that it claims are not actually major problems, to a sphere of opportunity. And moreover, in that same document, Tell the Truth, there's that same argument that was earlier stated. Sovereignty trumps everything else, trumps liberalism, trumps the international order. So here, one of the first points, Cambodia is a sovereign country. The sovereignty must be fully respected. The UN Charter, the same argument as China makes, the UN Charter clearly stipulates that no state has the right to intervene directly or indirectly for any reason whatsoever in the domestic affairs or in matters affecting the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. The ASEAN Charter, now a regional body, establishes the non-interference in the internal affairs of its member states as a basic principle under the agreement concerning the sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, and inviolability, neutrality, and national unity of Cambodia, which forms part of the comprehensive Cambodian peace agreement, known as the Paris Agreement. The 18 signatory states have the specific duty, quote, to refrain from interference in any form whatsoever, where, whether direct or indirect, in the internal affairs of Cambodia. And so this goes on. And obviously, this point here regarding the notion of international norms is one that countries like Cambodia use, where they would have their sovereignty respected. By implication, their sovereignty is not currently respected. And the UN and ASEAN charters are used to essentially say, we're supposed to have that respected. Paris peace agreements, we should supposed to have our sovereignty respected. So this is the kind of argument that's been made. And I think you'll see that in the memo to a greater extent. So Hun Sen argues, let us solve our own problems. And it's a message that I think he also adopts from the Chinese sort of mold in which, the United States is an outsider. So countries which are outside, he argues here, this is a quote, countries which are outside of the region always slap our heads and tell us what to do. I raise this issue not as a message for any particular country, but I would like to say that these Mekong countries are the typical, the political victims. So I request outsiders of the region who don't know about the issues to let us solve our problems. Myanmar is accused of genocide, but do you all understand Myanmar? Do you know about Myanmar? They have to solve a lot of challenging issues in relation with security. The countries that do not know our countries, please leave us to solve our problems for ourselves. So he's asking essentially for space. Please leave us alone. Let us do our own thing. And this was really fascinating. It's something he said at the World Economic Forum in 2018. Subsequent to the Tell the Truth paper, there was another white paper, much longer this time, 132 pages in Khmer, in which, again, the argument is color revolution is what the Western liberal order tries to do to Cambodia. They're trying to remove our legitimate regime and replace it with something that is not legitimate. And of course, the preamble to that document had a real gem of a quote in which Hun Sen says, real democracy in Cambodia has not been set back or fallen. Instead, it has been protected and strengthened in accordance with the principle of the rule of law for the great benefit of the people and nation. Only fake democracy has been abolished. So he's managed to, in one couple of sentences, reverse everything and say that what's happening in Cambodia is in fact real democracy, and what's happening, what color revolution and regime change are arguing for is fake democracy. It's very telling. And so why and how does Cambodia differentiate between the international norms and institutions governing nation states in general versus those applicable to their immediate region? In other words, does Cambodia have different visions of regional and global orders, and why? Well, you can see, Hun Sen in 2018, I think it was, went to Australia for the ASEAN-Australia Special Summit. There were protesters beforehand who were burning his image in effigy, and he said he'd send people to beat them up. And he's also, of course, argued that without Hun Sen, there is no ASEAN. So he says ASEAN without Hun Sen is not ASEAN. I'll just give the reason that I'm busy with the election. Hun Sen can veto a joint statement between ASEAN and Australia. This is typical, speaking in the third person about yourself. If you do something improper, Cambodia alone can make the statement get stuck. I would like to send a message in advance that if Cambodia does not agree, it means the statement will be impossible. So this consensus-driven approach of ASEAN becoming kind of a weakness that Hun Sen then exploits and is able to stop statements from coming out, stop meetings from happening. He's threatening here. And we saw that, of course, happening several times in the past. We've seen it, in 2012 at the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting where Cambodia was chair. They blocked the communique from coming out. ASEAN, of course, is weak from the standpoint of consensus-only approach. And further, in November 2012 of that year, a Cambodian government spokesperson, an old friend, actually told the media that Southeast Asian leaders had decided that they will not internationalize the South China Sea from now on. So using ASEAN, speaking for ASEAN when there was no agreement, and the idea of not internationalizing was, strictly speaking, from China's script. It's Chinese government spokesperson who said, we oppose the internationalization of the South China Sea. So that same image from earlier where ASEAN tries to play one entity, but then Cambodia, Laos, and others who are closer to China divide as non-claimant states. And of course, this year, Cambodia returns as ASEAN chair and tries to take over and do cowboy diplomacy, which of course blew up in its face, because when Hun Sen went and met with Myanmar's generals, this is the reception he got, with protesters and a refusal to have any more of this kind of cowboy diplomacy. So, he's trying, but it's obviously very problematic. And the irony, of course, is that he's trying to fix democracy in Myanmar, or the problems of legitimacy in Myanmar, while Cambodia's own democracy is in tatters. So he's not going at it with a lot of credibility. He didn't go meet with Aung San Suu Kyi. It doesn't seem like his envoy is interested in that either. So he's changing, I think, the regional organizations in directions that they're not interested necessarily in going. All right, thank you very much, and I'll stop here.